It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
He needs to go. He can't cling on in this way. His own party have finally concluded that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't now inflict him on the country for the next few months.
The UK is going to have a de facto lame duck Prime Minister in the midst of what could be a very severe economic downturn.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Danny Berger in London in for Francine Lacqua. Here's what's coming up on today's program. A nation in shock. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is described as being in a very grave condition after being shot at a campaign event. Pressure on Boris. The Prime Minister faces calls to speed up his exit from Downing Street after resigning. Plus, it's Jobs Day as Fed hawks back another 75 basis point hike, downplaying concerns of a recession. It's a fragile market, a lot of unease throughout the world and throughout these markets today. Stocks, little change from where they ended the day yesterday. We're looking at a gain of just 0.1% on these European indices. Euro dollar, the one to watch today, just moments ago, was under 101. We've come back slightly from that, but still down 0.6%. We are quickly sliding towards parity between the euro and the dollar. Non-farm payrolls today, that's the big data point to watch out. If it comes in very strong, that could accelerate this drop lower in the euro, which is currently trading at its lowest in 20 years, having to do with energy prices. But again, that rate differential might come more into play depending on what happens with jobs as well later today. UK pound sterling, that's also weaker this morning. That's under 120. Initially got a lift up yesterday after we learned that Boris Johnson was resigning. However, the greater issue in the UK is similar to that of Europe when it comes to the economy. So that taking over is the main force. And finally, 2s, 10s, just wanted to point out that we are still negative here, folks. Much of the curve is inverted, really occurring in the belly. We have Wells Fargo saying, don't start to estimate where we are when we're going to hit a recession because we are already there. We've had the Atlanta Fed GDP Now tracker show 2 quarters of negative growth, which would be the technical sign. But Wells Fargo says, look, it's a weakening consumer. All of that also points to a recession. So that's where we stand on these markets. But let's go back to the tragedy of this morning in Japan. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is being described as in grave condition. That's after he was shot at a political rally. And all of this we heard from Prime Minister Kishida speaking at an event earlier today, expressing his concern and his desire as well for his recovery. Let's go now to Bloomberg Opinion's Gerard Reedy, who's in Tokyo. Gerard, so, this occurred around 3:30 a.m. London time, so it's been a few hours. Are there any updates? Is there anything we know further about Abe's current condition?
In terms of his current condition, no, there's not too much more that we know. We do know, as you say, that Prime Minister Kishida described his condition as being grave earlier. We also know that his brother, Defense Minister Kishi, he said that Abe had undergone a blood transfusion. But what that means for his condition and for his outlook, we just don't know at this time. Just as I speak to you, his wife Akie has arrived at the hospital where he is being treated. Perhaps we might get an update once she has been updated, maybe in the next few hours.
In terms of the suspect here, we know they've apprehended someone around 40 years of age. We've heard more local reporting about who and what the motive might have been behind this suspect. What have those reports said?
Yeah, there's relatively little that we know at the moment. As you said, we know that a 41-year-old man has been arrested. He essentially gave himself up at the scene. In his conversations with police, he has told them, according to local reports, he has told them that it was his intention to kill Abe, that he bore a grudge against Abe, but he also added somewhat, I guess, sort of confusingly, that his attack was not politically motivated. So once again, we're just going to have to see what more comes out of that in the coming hours and days.
Gerard, for those who are perhaps less familiar with Japan when it comes to the prevalence or lack of prevalence of gun violence, how rare is this? How strange is this for what is a relatively very peaceful country?
Yeah, absolutely. Japan would pride itself on being a very safe place to be, and certainly, I would say both attacks on figures of, the types of figure that Abe is, and also gun violence in general, both very unusual. Even if a gun is shot and doesn't injure anyone, that will make headlines in the newspapers here. So for both of those things to happen, for this to be an attack of gun violence on someone like Abe, who is both domestically and internationally probably the most well-known Japanese politician of his generation, is quite extraordinary, and I think the nation is in shock over today's events.
Gerard, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Gerard Reedy from Tokyo, again, giving us the latest. Now, as we keep monitor of Abe, the grave condition he's in, of course, he's in the hospital. NHK reporting his wife has also arrived there. We'll continue to bring you updates as we get them. For now, though, let's take a pause on that. Turn to the UK, where Boris Johnson's plans to remain as caretaker prime minister are under increasing pressure. The ruling Conservative Party seeks to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. Standing by in Westminster is our UK reporter, Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, who would be the main contenders at this point to replace Johnson?
Danny, the bookies' favourites at the moment are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the former Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has served in the armed forces but doesn't have much senior cabinet experience, though he's using that he's spinning it as the opportunity for a clean start because of his distance from Boris Johnson amid all these scandals that have led to his downfall. Of course, military experience highly prized with the war in Ukraine going on, but the big other issue of the day, of course, is the cost of living crisis, which helps the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. But there's also the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. He has expressed that he'd be more open to tax cuts than Rishi Sunak, who is now seen as comparatively frugal, and that may appeal to the Tory core. But it comes down to experience then and the issues of the day and proximity to Boris Johnson, at least in the early stages.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, look, as we're speaking about early stages, there's a lot we don't know here. And one of them surely is, can Johnson actually last as caretaker PMs until a new leader is found?
Well, Danny, if you look at the front of the newspapers today in the UK, it seems that even though he has resigned, it might be too long to stay for some. The process to get a new leader could take until September unless it's accelerated. The Conservative Party wants to cut the candidates down to 2 by July 21st and then pick a new leader with the grassroots membership voting. But some of the voices against that include John Major, the former Conservative Prime Minister. He says that the interim cabinet may not be able to restrain Johnson, though Johnson has said he's not going to do anything radical or strange when it comes to policy. But the pressure will mount on Boris Johnson as we are seeing the Conservatives slide further and further behind Labour in the polls.
Lizzie, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden at Westminster there. Now, pre-market trading is up and open. Let's give you a look at Twitter has plunged 4%. This comes after a report late yesterday from the Washington Post that there are concerns over the Elon Musk Twitter deal. The Washington Post writing that people on Musk's team said that Twitter can't verify its figures on the spam accounts, that it's, quote, stopped engaging in discussions around funding the deal. This was one of the things that Musk's lawyers has said that Twitter needs to do, that it breached a covenant if they didn't have full communication. So not just the bot issue. Again, this is reporting from Washington Post yesterday. Twitter falling in the pre-market because of that. Of course, moves abound. It's not just corporate moves. It is the macro news we're also monitoring of the jobs data today. Let's dig into that. Joining us now is Janet Mui, head of market analysis at Bruin Dolphin. Janet, look, certainly this feeling of unease today. We have job figures later. It feels that the data very easily not just moves the market, but the Fed as well, who's started to cite things like University of Michigan sentiment surveys, which feels very, very strange. So how are you preparing? How are you looking at the jobs data today and how it could change your market outlook?
Hi, good morning, Danny. Thanks for having me. Well, first of all, I don't think that any of today's data will change the Federal Reserve's mind. They're pretty clear that they will continue these rate hikes. And also very likely that they will go ahead with another 75 basis point. So I really don't think that any particular data out from the non-farm payroll will be changing anything. So in terms of how we think about the economy, well, we do see that data is clearly slowing across the globe at the moment. Clearly, markets are very focused on the risk of a recession, clearly high probability of that happening. We have turned more cautious on the macro outlook and accordingly have turned also more cautious on our portfolio positioning. In particular, we're quite worried about Europe.
A lot to unpack there. Definitely need to get to Europe as we're on parity watch. But first, so it is an interesting cross current because we know the bulls, Bullard, Waller talking about yesterday, they still want 75 basis points. So on that front, you say, okay, makes sense for yields to move higher. And then the other front, it's this concern of recession. What does that mean for where treasuries go?
Yeah, so we have seen quite a fall in the U.S. Treasury yields recently from a high of 3.5% to a low of about 2.8%. We do think that there's scope for Treasury yields to go back up, primarily because of the fact that the Fed is still hiking. We do believe that bond yields probably usually peak around the time that the Fed would begin to end its rate hiking cycle. So we're really not there yet, although I think markets are pricing in rate cuts actually starting in the first quarter of next year. So we are actually closer to that end compared to previously. So we do think that Treasury yields would rise from here, but equally we do think that if it does go back to the previous level of around 3.5%, that could start to get quite attractive.
So 1001, that is currently where we are on the euro versus the dollar. I mean, just so close to parity. And in your mind, is there any reason to be bullish on the euro right now?
No, I think that there are many reasons to be bearish on the euro even after this significant falls. Well, we're turning really concerned about euro and the euro area as a whole because primarily is the concern on natural gas supply. We're really worried that as we head into the winter, the gas supply would be much more difficult to come by if Russia does weaponize its gas supply, and also we are also worried about the fragmentation in the euro area in terms of the different inflations that the areas are facing, and of course the bond yields of the periphery countries. And I mean, we're also worried that we know that the ECB is working on this anti-fragmentation program, but it is not clear how it is going to actually work, and we feel that there is just less scope for support this time.
Janet, afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining. Janet Mui, Head of Market Analysis at Brewin Dolphin. Want to bring you some breaking lines now coming from Japan. Japan's Motegi, who is a Japanese politician, diplomat, he's serving as the Secretary General of the Liberal Democrat Party, saying that Japan won't give in to violence, election to proceed. Of course, the backdrop for this is former Prime Minister Abe was speaking at a campaign event earlier today when he was shot twice. And again, there were questions as to what this meant for an upcoming election in the upper house set to happen on Sunday. We heard from the current Prime Minister Kishida saying that it was too soon to talk about this. They're now just monitoring Abe and his current condition, which so far we know he is unresponsive and it's been described as grave, waiting for updates there. But again, this Japanese official, Motegi, saying that they will not give in to the violence. The election will proceed. Again, that election set to take place on Sunday. Well, coming up, we're going to continue the conversation. Motegi saying that they will be stepping up safety precautions on this as well. All of this coming after Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, unresponsive, being shot at a political rally. We'll get back to Tokyo next. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition. I'm Danny Berger in London. Some breaking lines crossing the terminal over the ECB's climate stress test, saying that there's a possibility, a potential for 70 billion euros of losses. The ECB test sees that hit under a disorderly transition, physical risks, climate risks. It says that, though, that 70 billion euro figure, it might still underestimate the bank's climate risks, also saying that most banks don't have robust climate stress test framework. So that's the latest from the ECB there. Still with us today is Janet Mui, Head of Market Analysis at Brewin Dolphin. I mean, look, Janet, a lot of risks for Europe, but looking at what's happening in China, more stimulus announced today. Is there any potential for that sort of stimulus to in turn help Europe? The connection there, do you see any reason to be optimistic?
We see that basically it is more benefiting domestic China more than internationally. First of all, I think, yes, there is stimulus, but I think the scope is nowhere near the scale that was really helpful before, that actually can trickle down to help the global economy. First of all, the scale of that stimulus is not as much. And I think, currently the problem is in Europe is mainly inflation. So half of the inflation in Europe comes from oil, electricity, food, et cetera, et cetera. So it's unclear how, any sort of external support or growth factors can help Europe because it's primarily a domestic Europe inflation problem. So it's really tricky to help Europe at this point. I think, I want to bring back to the point about China.
Sure.
We're currently more favoring China and the surrounding region because of, primarily it's because of the potential for more easing and stimulus coming through that is, is historically quite positive for the Chinese domestic stock market.
Yeah, I mean, we look at, for example, Carlyle, they've slashed the amount of China that they're holding in their fund. Obviously a different prospect because they're looking at private markets, right? But do you think that the sentiment around China has just gone too far? It's just been too negative?
Yes, we do think that sentiment has gone too negative. I think 2 months ago, I think the valuations start to hit quite attractive entry point. So that's why we have actually increased our exposure to Asia Japan equities. Valuations are attractive. China is easing while the rest of the world is actually tightening policy. That's really quite distinctive what China is doing. So it really acts as a bit of a hedge for global investors who are looking to diversify and looking for some sort of uncorrelated returns. And also we are seeing China data rebounding from that really bad level, right? We see the PMI finally rebounding because of the easing of the lockdown. So we do think that the worst is probably in the rear mirror for China.
Janet, thank you so much. Great to get all your thoughts this morning. That's Janet Mui, Head of Market Analysis at Brewin Dolphin. Now, coming up, we're continuing to monitor the events in Japan with former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe being described as unresponsive. He was speaking at a political event, a campaign event earlier this morning. He was shot twice. Again, current conditions describe him as unresponsive. We'll get back to Tokyo next. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Danny Berger in London. We are just inching ever closer to reaching euro parity. Euro dollar now trading under 101. It's at its lowest since December 2002, so nearly a 20-year low. This week it sold off more than 3%, the worst week since March of the pandemic, the start of the pandemic of 2020. Really kicked into high gear, that selling after energy prices throughout Europe hitting records, especially in Germany. Of course, the next catalyst could be the payrolls report later today. Will a strong number be the thing that just tips euro dollar over into parity? Well, let's get some of our other top stories today. With the Bloomberg First Word News is Leanne Gerrans. Good morning, Leanne.
Hi, Danny. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida says former leader Shinzo Abe is in a grave condition after being shot in the western city of Nara during a political event. He said the shooting is absolutely unforgivable. One man is now in custody. National broadcaster NHK says a 67-year-old was taken to hospital unconscious and unresponsive. Japan's foreign minister says Sunday's upper house elections will proceed. Now, President Joe Biden will discuss possible reductions in U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods in a meeting with his advisors set for Friday. But sources tell us it's not clear if he intends to decide on a path forward. Biden has been weighing a decision to remove some of the tariffs to help curb inflation. His predecessor, Donald Trump, imposed duties on some $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. Former European and world football chiefs Sepp Blatter and Michel Platini have been acquitted by a Swiss court following a trial over suspected fraud. That's according to the AFP news agency. Switzerland's federal criminal court rejected the prosecution's request for a suspended prison sentence of 1 year and 8 months, while Blatter and Platini maintained their innocence throughout that trial. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Danny.
Leanne, thanks so much. Coming up on the program, the UK's Conservatives are accelerating plans to choose Boris Johnson's successor. But who will replace him? Again, that debate yesterday saw the sterling pop above 120. At the moment on cable, we are trading at 119. Of course, there were potential buying opportunities if this meant soft relations with the EU. But again, those inflation concerns and economic concerns acute in the UK. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. A nation in shock. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is described as being in a very grave condition after being shot at a campaign event. Pressure on Boris, the Prime Minister, faces calls to speed up his exit from Downing Street after resigning. Plus, it's jobs day as Fed hawks back another 75 basis point hike, downplaying concerns of a recession. Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. This is the early edition. I'm Danny Berger in London. A lot of unease today. And with that, let's get straight to the breaking news that earlier this morning, Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at a political event was shot. He currently is being described as in grave condition. We also heard from the current Prime Minister Kishida, who again said that he was in a grave condition and wished for his recovery, as we all are at this moment. For more, let's get to Bloomberg Opinion's Gerard Reedy, who is in Tokyo. Gerard, we're hearing from the Secretary General of the LDP when it comes to the elections taking place this Sunday. Sounds like they're still going to occur.
Yeah, it looks like, as you said, Motegi said that the elections were going to go ahead. I think for a couple of hours there, it wasn't sure what the potential ramifications might be of today's attack on Sunday's elections. I am assuming that they are content now that it was a one-off attack. There is no danger to the elections. And Motegi, as you said, has said that Japan won't be cowed into making changes to the elections that are going to take place.
And in terms of the current conditions of the former Prime Minister Abe, of course, he was speaking at a campaign for the event for those elections on Sunday. We know that he's in a grave condition. Is that about as much as we know at this point, Gerard?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have no update. I guess it's been about 6 hours now since the attack itself occurred. We heard initially that he was found without life signs immediately after the attack. Kishida described his condition as grave earlier. We also heard from his brother, Defense Minister Kishi, who said that Abe had undergone blood transfusions. We don't know really what that means for his condition or his prognosis. A short while ago, his wife, Akie, arrived at the hospital where he's being treated. It's possible we might hear some more in the coming hours.
And I should note that the Japanese Finance Minister Suzuki is currently speaking in Tokyo, going back to what we were initially speaking about, Gerard, saying that to change the election plans would mean a loss for democracy. Now, when it comes to this type of violence, again, we have a T-Live blog going up right now. It talks about the idea that there were only 10 incidents of gun violence in Japan last year. How strange is this? How rare is this for this type of violence to occur?
Yeah, I think both in terms of gun violence itself and attacks on, such prominent figures as Abe, both of these things by themselves are very rare, and to have them coincide in today's attack, almost unprecedented, I would say, especially when it comes to someone with the sort of both domestic and international profile that Abe has. Gun violence is not really a thing here. If a gun is fired, even if it doesn't hit anyone, that will make national headlines here because it's just such a rare event to happen. Certainly not what you would expect to happen in a country that has historically prided itself on being a safe society.
Gearoid, thank you so much for keeping us updated throughout the morning and your evening Tokyo time. Gearoid Reedy there of Bloomberg Opinion. Again, the latest we've heard, the Japanese finance minister confirming that there will be an election, saying that to change the election plans would mean a loss for democracy. We'll keep you on top as all those headlines coming out of Tokyo as we receive them. Let's take a pause on that for now, though, and turn to the UK, where Boris Johnson's plan to remain as caretaker UK Prime Minister are under increasing pressure. The ruling Conservative Party is seeking to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. For more, let's go to Westminster, where we're joined by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, looking for a successor, who could that possibly be?
Danny, it's a wide open race at this early stage, but the initial favourites from the bookies are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the ex-Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has served in the armed forces, though he hasn't held a senior cabinet role. He's using that to his advantage. He's saying that he could provide a clean slate because of his distance from Boris Johnson and all the scandals that mean he has had to step down. Of course, military experience highly prized because of the war in Ukraine going on at this moment. But the other thing that's happening in the UK is the cost of living crisis. So that helps Rishi Sunak, the ex-chancellor who resigned this week. He'll be hoping his resignation can rehabilitate his image somewhat after the debacle over his wife's tax affairs, his involvement in the Partygate scandal. Then, of course, there's also his replacement, the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. He's signalled his willingness to be less frugal fiscally than Rishi Sunak. That could appeal to the Tory core. You heard a donor being interviewed on Bloomberg TV earlier saying that we need to make Britain more attractive, perhaps through tax cuts. It's a difficult one to call at this stage, but the Tories want to whittle it down to two names by July the 21st, pick a leader by September, but even that's not fast enough for many in the party who want to see Boris Johnson out already.
Lizzie, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden there. Now we're joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs Asset Management Chairman and ex-UK government minister. Jim, thanks so much for joining us. And as much as an economist, you are also a historian of these markets, of this world, looking at the period of unease, of upheaval that we're going through, whether it's senseless violence in Japan that we're dealing with at the moment, whether it be political upheaval in the UK, the prospect of war still ongoing. What does history tell us about these moments of upheaval, of where we move from here?
Well, I think you're being very complimentary. I'm not sure I'm a seasoned, experienced person to offer historical perspective, but I won't miss the chance. You know, I think the real thing is, in my opinion, that these moments pass. They always seem so staggering when we go through them, and in that regard, it's shocking to wake up this morning and hear the news about the tragic shooting in Japan. But you know, these moments pass, and however difficult they are in that case, and the chaos here in the UK with the Tory mess. That, you know, our democracies should be strong enough to somehow rebound from these issues. And indeed, one might argue, as it relates to the UK at least, here's a sign of democracy working even inside the Tory machine. So, you know, I also want to add, in the broader context of the Russian invasion and COVID reappearing here and everywhere else, you know, one of the few things I learned in close to 40 years of being immersed in all this stuff is never let a crisis go to waste. There's always a tomorrow for at least some people.
Jim, no surprise that not only are you humble, but eloquent as well. You certainly sell yourself short. Look, you've been in the room in this country when many of the important decisions are being made. What must it be like now trying to continue fiscal policy, to continue the function of this government when there are these questions over leadership?
Well, I think it's quite clear there's a lot of emotion driving what's being said in the past 24 hours. If you look at Boris Johnson's speech yesterday, full of emotion and full of vindictiveness, really. One might say consistent with his general style that nothing ever is his problem, it's always everybody else's fault. But I can, given how he, within the past few weeks said he expected to be there for a third term, he must be, pretty shell-shocked. And I think a lot of people who are focusing so much on the issue about him staying on till September are also understandably being very emotional. But in reality, I think what's going to happen here is somebody has to be the caretaker until we get a new leader and therefore a new prime minister. And the quicker that can happen, arguably the better. Although I quickly add, below the surface, and I'm sure we'll see it when leading candidates emerge, the Tory party needs to figure out what it really stands for in this contemporary era about global and domestic issues. To
that point, what would we be looking for because of the issues? I mean, not just the UK, but the globe, but especially the UK is dealing with. What would we look for from the next government to tackle those types of things?
I mean, I think it, a part of Boris's problem on top of his personality is he seems to want to be popular about everything. So he would promise everything and deny everything. And so constantly talking about lower taxes, but taking tax rates to the highest levels in a long, long time. And at the same time, spending public money as though it just came off a tree. And I think, it's not easy because there's some big issues around that policymakers have to deal with. But I think the Tory party has to, through this election campaign, rebuild itself still after Brexit. A slightly encouraging sign, as an example I'd give you, the appointment of Greg Clark as the new Housing and Levelling Up Minister is a very interesting development, even though it's possibly only temporary, because Greg is a seasoned policymaker from the pragmatic side and would have been associated with the Remain fringe. And so we need the next leader to be adult and to have a cabinet of the most capable people that can help deliver a coherent economic policy for the UK that needs to be centered around serious initiatives to boost UK productivity.
Who do you think would be up to that task?
To be really honest with you, it's not entirely clear to me at the start of this. And indeed, if you look over the long history of how Tory leaders emerge, it's not impossible that a name will appear through the process which just that person seems to have the grasp of the complexity of the challenges and the voting base of the country. But we need somebody, to put it in the context of a Bloomberg audience, that sort of makes capitalism work better for more people. The UK growth performance since the financial crisis in 2008 hasn't actually been that bad by European or G7 standards, but it's been dominated by massive increases in low-paid employment with dreadful productivity. And given that our labour force is now not rising by anything like the level it once was, the only way we can get growth is by boosting productivity, unless we're going to have permanently higher inflation. And it's not it's tough to pull that off, but we need a proper plan.
Well, we've had Zahawi come in and take a different tone, perhaps, than Sunak, talking about tax cuts, for example, looking between the two of them in a new direction, perhaps coming from Zahawi. Which of them, to you, seems better equipped to take us, as you point out, that way towards capitalism and competitiveness for the UK economy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, to some degree, I'm going to say I'm not sure either does. I think we need to have a much more clearer framework for what is the goal of fiscal policy. All this talk about tax cuts, and I see Tom Tugendhat has already said that for his campaign in the Telegraph today, is very dangerous in the current environment, both socially and economically, particularly the talk of corporate tax cuts. In an era where wealth inequality has risen a lot and perceptions of inequality have risen further, and the government claims it's focused on leveling up and doing so much to help people left behind. Why on earth is there an urgent need to cut corporate taxes when there is no evidence in the past 20 years that lower corporate taxes have actually contributed to higher investment spending or productivity? It's just a standard popular gimmick amongst business friends of the Tory party, and that's really quite worrying, in my opinion. What we need is, I would argue, and I'm campaigning for this, we need a whole new approach to fiscal policy that I'd call it a very modern adult version of what became known as the Golden Rule under the early days of the Blair leadership. And by that, I'm not suggesting it's a Labour approach. We need a much more imaginative approach here in the UK, in Europe, and around the developed world, so we can have government spending on investments to help
Jim,
productivity
I'm going to have to jump in there.
Parts of the world. And
we're up against a commercial break.
Sure.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end things there. Really appreciate you joining us this morning. A timely conversation there with Lord Jim O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs Asset Management Chairman and ex-UK government minister. Thanks again for joining us. Now, coming up, we're going to be joined by British businesswoman Penny Hughes, the former head of Coca-Cola for Britain and Ireland. She switched her focus to the property market. We'll get more into the UK business story next. This is Bloomberg. Let's go straight to breaking news this morning. NHK reporting that the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been pronounced dead. This is, of course, after earlier this morning around 3:30 a.m. UK time. Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister, was speaking at a campaign event. He was shot twice. He was quickly transported to a hospital. From there, we knew his condition was grave. But again, NHK reporting now that the former prime minister has died. He, of course, leaves behind him a very, very hefty legacy, to put it in the least. Shinzo Abe bringing stability back to Japan, strengthening relations between the U.S. and China, a loss that is very felt throughout not just the world, but of course Japan as well. At the moment, there are elections set to take place on Sunday. Finance Minister Suzuki did tell the press moments ago that plans to change the election would mean a loss for democracy. Again, that was before, as we have just learned, that the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan has died. NHK is currently reporting that. He had died from gunshot wounds. He was speaking at a political event in Nara, that's the western part of Western Japan. Shinzo Abe was 67 years old. Of course, among this audience, he's very widely known for his Abenomics as the country dealt with the financial crisis, pushing into negative rates. But it's not just the impact on the economy. Again, it is the legacy he leaves behind when it comes to politics. It was a very tumultuous time in Japanese politics before Abe was at the helm. Went through a variety of prime ministers before Abe, including himself, I should say, but he stepped in as the prime minister, ushering this period of more consistency than Japan had seen in some time. So again, the latest lines that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan has died. He was speaking again at a political event this morning. He was shot twice. The suspect has been apprehended. The suspect is in his 40s. Again, worth reiterating how rare gun crime is in Japan. It is very difficult to obtain a gun. And at the same time, last year, there were only 10 cases of gun-related incidents. And again, incidents, not necessarily gun violence. It just underscores how rare this is for the country. Again, NHK reporting that Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister of Japan, has died. He has died from gunshot wounds. He was quickly transported to the hospital. His wife, moments ago, was seen going into the hospital, so she surely is beside him as well. Again, a tragedy occurring in Japan. He leaves, again, a really big legacy as well. We heard earlier in the morning as well from the current Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, visibly shaken of this news, as I'm sure many in Japan are. And now let's dig further into this. I want to take us to Tokyo at the moment. We've been speaking all this morning with Bloomberg's opinion Gerold Riedy, who's standing by. So, Gerold, we of course were monitoring. We knew he was in a grave condition. There were a lot of concerns around Abe. But again, the latest news coming from NHK that the former prime minister of Japan has died. Tell us about the kind of legacy that Abe leaves behind him.
Yeah, this is really extraordinary news, even knowing, having been about 6 hours from the attack and knowing that news like this was likely. Abe can only be described, I think, as a political giant in Japan, the most influential and most well-known politician of his generation. A two-time prime minister who came back from the ignominy of his short-lived first tenure to come back and become the longest-serving prime minister in Japanese history. A swath of accomplishments that he was able to get through during his time in power, including long-lasting changes to Japan's security legislation, extraordinary monetary easing that he implemented that really got Japan out of the deflationary spiral that it was in, putting the economy on a much better track than it was on before, supporting reconstruction from the earthquake in 2011, and many other extraordinary things, including, of course, bringing the Olympics to Japan, bringing Japan into the TPP. Really, the list of his legacies and his accomplishments is too long to go through here.
And again, for those just tuning into the program now, again, NHK reporting that former Japanese Prime Minister Abe has been declared dead at the hospital he is currently at. He was receiving treatment in the Nara prefecture, where, again, he was shot twice following a campaign event. Abe was 67 years old. Gerold, in terms of what happens now, again, comments as to Sunday's election, which Abe had been campaigning for, these comments, of course, occurred before we learned the news of his tragic death. But at the moment, it does seem like those Sunday elections are going to continue. How will this color and shape those elections with this tragic passing?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to say. I think they will try to go ahead with the elections, as you say. Several cabinet ministers said that the elections will go ahead, though, of course, that final decision might not be up to them. I do think the elections will go ahead. As to what impact this has, I almost hesitate to speculate, given how unprecedented an event this is. My best guess would be that you would see, a greater turnout than maybe otherwise you would have, and greater support for the LDP than perhaps otherwise you would have. But I think we'll just have to see how that plays out on Sunday. I would suggest it's the least of our concerns right now.
Absolutely. Again, it is a tragedy. Gerold, in terms of the suspect in this case who has been apprehended, what do we know there?
Right now, there's very little that we do know. We know he's a man aged 41. He is reported to be a former member of the self-defense forces, which in and of itself is unusual. There's varying reports coming out right now of his conversations with police. He was taken into custody rather immediately after the shooting. According to one report, he said that he did intend to kill Abe because he bore a grudge against him, but he also said that his grudge was not politically motivated. According to another report in the Mainichi, he said, he's alleged to have said, that he was trying to shoot someone else who was not even reportedly at the speech. It's not really clear if what he is saying right now is intended to be a deception or really who knows. At this point in time, police have just begun to search his apartment. Perhaps we'll know a little bit more a little bit after that.
Also, I want to note for our audience that the hospital where Abe has died, the former prime minister, has now said that they will be holding a brief at 6 p.m. local time in Japan. So we will bring you that as it occurs. And as we wrap up this hour, Geroyd, I think, again, we should really emphasize just how huge of a figure Abe was, not just in politics, but in Japan. Only about 30 seconds here, Geroyd, but tell us again this legacy, especially when it comes to international relations.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Abe really sort of changed Japan's position in the world, I think, from, you know, where it was, if you remember, you know, in 2012 after the earthquake. He really sort of shifted the narrative on Japan and, of course, was a huge figure within the LDP itself, leading its largest faction still.
Geroyd, thank you so much for joining us again. We'll continue to monitor the response tragedy in Japan. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared dead. Again, a tragedy for Japan.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Kailey Leinz in New York. Guy Johnson stepping in for Anna Edwards in London. Our top story today, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died after being shot at a campaign event. That's according to NHK. It's stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are very rare. The Federal Reserve hawks are still pushing for a 75 basis point hike this month to fight inflation. Today's U.S. jobs report will likely factor into the central bank's decision. And Boris Johnson is pressed to make a quick exit from number 10 and checkers. The Conservative Party wants to choose his successor by the end of the summer. So, Kailey, we've got this shocking news that the former Prime Minister of Japan, the longest serving Prime Minister in post-war history, has died of a gunshot.
Yeah, a tragedy in Japan, but of course there is a real economic legacy we will dig into throughout this hour. The Abenomics legacy, where this leaves Japan, will be something that we continue to focus on. Now, of course, for Asian markets, the news that he had been shot did hit about midway through the session, and as a result, you saw stocks coming off of session highs. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index only up about 0.4%, and in Japan, the Nikkei 225 ending the day about 0.1% higher after previously being as high as 1.5%. But of course, that equity action does not actually reflect the news that we have had confirmation, according to NHK, that Abe has indeed died from that gunshot wound. Now, you did see some strength coming into the Japanese yen. That may be a bit due to the uncertainty caused by an event like this, a bit of a bid for a haven asset. There's also the question of how this may alter policy going forward, both on the fiscal and monetary side. Right now, the yen is trading at 135.71 against the dollar, and that bid for a haven not really reflected in the bond market, which seems to be back focused on the idea that central banks are going to be tightening policy aggressively to tame inflation. So you're seeing a lot of movement continually at the short end of the curve. The 2-year yield in Australia overnight up about 6 basis points, Guy.
Let's talk about what's happening here in Europe. We're waiting for the payrolls number, basically. We've got an eye on what's happening in Japan, but we are looking forward to what's happening with payrolls. European equities are kind of drifting sideways at the moment, a little lower, but not by much. The only market that's really seeing significant downside is the CAC 40 in Paris, where the FTSE's only down by 0.3%. So we're going sideways there. In terms of where the real action is, I think it's in the foreign exchange markets and it's also in the energy markets. Those are the two areas you want to be paying attention to right now. So stocks going nowhere. Euro dollar, we we are definitely on parity watch. If we get a strong payroll today, could that be enough to tip the euro through parity against the US dollar? We'll continue to watch that very carefully. We're down by around 0.5%. But this is the trade I think you want to pay attention to. What is happening with natural gas is where the real action is in Europe. Gas prices have surged. I think we're going to have another week higher. We've got electricity prices absolutely surging. Electricity is becoming a luxury here in Europe. It is going to do significant damage at these prices to the economic trajectory of Europe. The ECB's in a real bind as a result of that. That euro story, a reflection of dollar strength, but also of significant euro weakness. 10-year German bonds, as you can see, catching a little bit of a bid. We are coming down again. Yields just coming down a little bit, but it's been such a topsy-turvy week for bond markets. We are awaiting, Matt, to see what happens with that story with payrolls a little bit later on. But we're looking both ways. We're looking east and west today. Payrolls west. East, we're watching very firmly what is happening out in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. A tragic and historic day. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has reportedly died. We're going to be covering that story for you, of course, very shortly. I just want to quickly point out what's happening in markets. Of course, a lot of times traders will sit on their hands until the payrolls number comes out. That's just about 3.5 hours from now. S&P futures down, so maybe we give up some of the gains that we've made this week. It's been a pretty decent week for the S&P, especially for tech stocks. The NASDAQ was up 2.3% yesterday. U.S. 10-year yield coming down just a couple of basis points right now at 297.42 as investors buy up that debt. And crude, speaking of topsy-turvy, it's been a very volatile week for crude, bouncing up and down through the $100 mark. Right now, Texas Intermediate at 101.73 a barrel. So giving up some of the gains that we saw yesterday. Bitcoin right now down about 1%, but at $21,381. It's been a decent week for the digital asset. Now, our top story has to be former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He has reportedly died after being shot at a campaign event yesterday. This according to NHK, yesterday our time, of course. A suspect was arrested moments after the attack, and it appears that the firearm was homemade. Of course, there are incredibly few firearm deaths in Japan. It has one of the strictest gun control policies in the Western world. Joining us now for the latest from Tokyo is Geroid Rady, who covers Japan for Bloomberg Opinion. Geroid, what do we know about the possibility that this prime minister has died? He is the longest serving prime minister in a post-war Japan.
How you doing? Certainly he was the longest-serving prime minister until his shock resignation a couple of years ago. NHK is reporting, citing, I should say, senior LDP executives that he is indeed, he has been confirmed dead. I do believe the hospital where he was being treated is holding a press conference right as we speak. Of course, if that's true, it's an absolutely shocking turn of events in a country that, as you say, has very little gun violence, and it's certainly very little gun violence towards, you know, national figures such as Abe. It truly is one of the most shocking days that I can remember in all my time covering Japan.
Upper house elections this Sunday. Do we think they're going to go ahead?
What we're hearing so far from senior cabinet ministers is that that they want them to go ahead. They say they're not going to be cowed into changing the plans, and certainly that democracy would suffer if they change the plans as a result of this. They spoke before. Abe was reported to have been pronounced dead, so we will see, I think, how things go ahead. My suspicion would be that, given what we know about the suspect, and given that it does appear to be an individual who has been arrested, I would suspect that the elections will go ahead as planned.
And what about economic policy in Japan? Is there any reason to believe that once Abe is gone, that will change, that the legacy of Abenomics is going to be a thing of the past?
Very difficult to tell, I think, at this point in time. Prime Minister Kishida had certainly carried on a number of aspects of Abenomics, but he had already been pushing towards his own form of economic policy, what he calls his new capitalism. Whether this will have any impact on that or potentially make it more difficult to undo some of the things that Abe did, I think we'll really have to wait and see, you know, until we know a little bit more.
All right, Bloomberg's Garrod Reedy reporting on this breaking news from Tokyo. Thank you so much. We'll have more throughout the hour. Again, NHK reporting that Japan's longest-serving Premier Shinzo Abe has died after being shot at an event earlier today. He was 67 years old. Now, heading over to Washington, earlier the White House had weighed in on this event, saying, quote, "We are shocked and saddened to hear about the violent attack against former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We are closely monitoring the reports and keeping our thoughts with his family and the people of Japan." Meanwhile, the administration is also looking elsewhere in Asia, nearing a decision on trade with China. Bloomberg has learned that President Biden will meet with advisors today about rolling back tariffs on Chinese goods. Emily Wilkins, Bloomberg government reporter, joins us now from Farmington Hills, Michigan, for the details. So, Emily, is this just another way the administration is trying to be seen, trying to do something about inflation?
Absolutely, Kailey. I mean, inflation still remains really the #1 issue for the Biden administration right now when it comes to what's going to impact the upcoming midterms, as well as just day-to-day quality for Americans. But there's really a question about exactly how much this move could potentially help Americans feeling some of that price pressure. I mean, this could impact a number of products coming over from China, chips, appliances, apparel, but it's not going to impact things like gas, like food. That's where Americans are really feeling the price pressure right now. At the same point, there is a chance that the U.S. is headed for a recession, and you have heard Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo saying that this could be something that would at least slightly ease pressure from Americans at this point.
Emily, why are you in Michigan?
So, as you know, there is a midterm coming up. That's not till November, but primaries are being decided right now. Michigan has a particularly interesting one. You've got two Democratic incumbents, Haley Stevens and Andy Levin, that are going up against each other. It's going to be a very interesting primary in terms of sort of what people are thinking of as the future of the Democratic Party, what Democrats really need to do to make sure that they are successful in the next several years. So that primary is coming up on August 2nd, but wanted to get on the ground. And also speaking with folks, it's an interesting area. You know, this is very much automotive manufacturing, the automotive industry. And I've talked with a number of people who have said that their jobs have been impacted because of delays with the supply chain and a lack of chips and other parts for automobiles.
All right, Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government, thank you so much. Of course, the economy, a huge factor in those midterm elections. So let's talk more about that. Federal Reserve officials are playing down the risk of a recession while making the case for another 75 basis point hike this month. Fed Governor Chris Waller and St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard both spoke yesterday.
If we don't get the inflation under control, inflation expectations could become unmoored.
We need to move to a much more restrictive setting in terms of interest rates and policy. And we need to do that as quickly as possible. I'm definitely in support of doing another 75 basis point hike in July.
Those remarks, of course, come ahead of the U.S. jobs report out today at 8:30 a.m. New York time. Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent, joins us now with more from what to expect from the data. So 268,000 is the estimate?
That's the estimate. And the question is, how does the bond market read it? Because the Fed guys are saying we're overheating. The bond market is saying we're going into recession. Here's the numbers we're expecting, as Kailey says, 268,000. Now, that seems like a big come down from where we were, but that is going to be the only the lowest since 2019. And so it is a pretty good number. 488,000 has been the average so far, but in the 2 years leading up to the pandemic, it was only 184. So that's still very strong. 3.6. We're not expecting to move down from there, but if we do, that could be amazing, because at this point, 3.6 is the lowest since 2019. You have to go back to 1969 to get below that at 3.4. The 5.2% is a year-over-year basis in terms of what we're looking at for average hourly earnings. And the thing you want to watch here really is the monthly number. It's been 0.3 for the last 2 months. The Fed doesn't want to see that go up. And the participation rate, if that continues to tick up, that's good news. If it doesn't, and we get a lot of jobs, this number, unemployment, is going to go down. So are we in recession? Well, this number will give us, today's number will give us some idea of what's going on. The SOM rule is something that a lot of people at the Fed follow. It suggests you have to rise 0.5 percentage point to get into a recession. The unemployment rate has to rise. And that's what's happened in all these recessions prior to this, except look where we are today. We are not anywhere near that kind of increase. So the Fed's going to tell you we're not in recession, but at 8:31 this morning, the bond market's going to give us their own vote.
Absolutely. Fascinating number. Can't wait to see what happens here a little bit later on. We're all on tenterhooks. Mike McKee, thank you very much indeed. And as a result, we've got some great coverage coming up. We've got an interview with the Labour Secretary, Marty Walsh. That's going to follow the delivery of the jobs report. That interview, 9:40 a.m. New York time, 2:40 p.m. here in London. Let's turn to British politics now. Boris Johnson plans to remain as the UK's caretaker Prime Minister. But those plans are under increasing pressure. The ruling Conservative Party is seeking to accelerate the contest to choose his successor by the end of the summer. He made his resignation statement yesterday.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place.
Are we going to see an accelerated process? We're joined now from Westminster by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, let's talk about the process, how quickly it could happen, and who are now the front runners in that race.
Well, Guy, it's a wide open race at the moment, but the bookies' favourites so far are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, the ex-Defence Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who has military experience but hasn't had a senior cabinet role. He's trying to play that to his advantage, spinning it as his distance from Boris Johnson and the scandals that brought the Prime Minister down. But of course, military experience highly prized in this moment from all of them because of the war in Ukraine. The other big issue in the UK at the moment, the cost of living crisis, that could play to the ex-Chancellor Rishi Sunak, though his reputation is somewhat in rehabilitation mode at the moment because of the debacle over his wife's tax affairs, his involvement in Partygate. So some might look to the new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi. He's signalled that he'd be perhaps more open to tax cuts, which could appeal to the Tory core. Whoever they pick, Guy, the Conservatives say that they're going to try to whittle it down to 2 names by July the 21st, pick a new leader by September, but even that is far too long for many of them to leave Boris Johnson in Downing Street because the Conservatives are plunging in the polls compared to the Labour Party.
All right, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden, thank you so much for your great reporting over the last couple of days. Now to another story we have our eye on this morning. Elon Musk's $44 billion deal for Twitter is in jeopardy and may fall apart over his doubts that the company is accurately reporting the number of spam bots on the service. The Washington Post reporting yesterday that Musk's team has concluded that Twitter can't verify its figures on the spam accounts and has, quote, stopped engaging in discussions around funding the deal. So that is having an impact on Twitter shares in pre-market trading this morning. They're down by about 4%, trading right around $37 a share, which is $17 below Elon Musk's offer price of $54.20. Another stock that is moving lower is GameStop, the company firing its CFO and cutting other jobs, really trying to shift as demand in the gaming space shifts as well. That stock is down about 6%. Before the bell. Finally, I also wanted to check on one group of stocks, really the ARK Innovation ETF, of course, tracks a bundle of them, but it really is the poster child for growth, for risk. It has not done well this year, down about 50% year to date, but it was up about 13.6% on the week this week coming into today, as we've seen a little bit of a rebound rally in some of those names. However, it's giving some of that back this morning. Guy, down about 1.7% before the bell.
We'll keep an eye on what is happening there. Coming up, NHK is reporting that the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died. Tina Barrett, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University in Tokyo, will join us next. We're also going to hear a little bit later on what is happening here in Europe. Get some analysis from Joachim Fels, Global Economic Advisor at PIMCO. That's all coming up. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Guy Johnson in London. Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz both over in New York. Anna Edwards is off today. So the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died. This after being shot at a campaign event. We're getting a briefing now from the doctor that has treated him, indicating that Abe was in a grave condition when he arrived at hospital and that he suffered a small gunshot wound to the right of his neck. Finance Minister Suzuki has also been speaking, saying it's hard to believe such a thing could happen in Japan. Joining us now for analysis, Tina Barrett, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University in Tokyo. Tina, shocking news from Japan. What are the implications?
Well, I think for a society where gun crime is very low, this is a really shocking incident. Made the more shocking, I think, for a lot of people in Japan by the fact that the gun seems to have been homemade. And this makes people, I think, feel more afraid than they would ordinarily, because guns are very difficult to get your hands on in Japan. But the fact that an individual can make a gun, I think, is something that's quite news to individuals in Japan. And so this is sort of creating an exacerbated sense of shock in the country right now.
Abe was a huge figure in Japan. What do you think his legacy will ultimately be?
Yeah, I mean, he was the longest post-war serving prime minister in Japanese history. He is a figure, I think, who's internationally recognized, which is not something we can say about a lot of Japanese figures. And I think he really did bring more attention to Japan globally. He formed good relationships with a lot of international partners, other leaders. So that element of his policy and his legacy, I think, is something that people in Japan universally are proud of. Otherwise, he was quite a controversial figure domestically, in particular in terms of his defense policy and his more assertive stance on defense issues. For example, reinterpreting Japan's pacifist constitution, some of his laws around security, for example, secrecy laws, which made it more difficult, for example, for journalists to talk to whistleblowers. So Abe is, I think, a big figure in Japanese politics, but his legacy is quite a complicated one.
I don't think it helps at all to speculate as to why he was assassinated, but I do want to focus in on the controversy that you just brought up, in the sense that, we're at a point where Germany is now beefing up its military in response to a more aggressive Russia. Isn't it appropriate that Japan, now 75 years later, starts to build up its own military in response to a more aggressive China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the nub of the controversy. Some people in Japan think, absolutely, we live in a much more dangerous world, a much more dangerous region, with China building up its own military, and the antagonism around the Senkaku Islands, that dispute that exists with China. But on the other hand, some people see Japan's more assertive defense policy as being antagonistic towards countries like China, especially in combination with Abe's sort of symbolic gestures, like visiting controversial sites in Tokyo connected to the Second World War, places that have historical resonance for Korea and Japan and China as well. So I think we see a very divided country when it comes to what's the right course of action regarding defense policy.
Will Japan continue to strengthen its sovereignty post-Abe, or does this change anything politically?
I think in that sense, probably not a great deal will change. And we've already seen Prime Minister Kishida in the past year really asserting his independence from Abe, who I think thought after his ally Kishida became prime minister that he would still be pulling some of the strings behind and be a bit of sort of kingpin within the LDP. And that hasn't really happened. We've seen Kishida really following quite his own line of policies. So I think Abe's influence over politics was already waning. So I don't see there being actually that much change based on his now sad departure from the political scene.
What about his influence over monetary policy? Because to some extent, Abe saw the Bank of Japan as somewhat of an extension of the Japanese government. And I'm wondering how that relationship may change if there no longer is Abe to support Kuroda and the decisions that he's making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably is something that we're going to have to watch in the next few days. But as I say, I think Prime Minister Kishida has been his own person regarding his policies, certainly since winning a general election victory in October last year. So I don't think necessarily that this is going to signal a huge amount of change vis-a-vis monetary policy or really many other policies.
And the elections on Sunday, does this have any influence in the outcome? I
mean, I think we might see some sympathy votes for the LDP, and Prime Minister Kishida's popularity, which has actually been reasonably high for a Japanese Prime Minister, has waned a little bit in recent weeks. This may give a bit of a boost to his party, since he and former Prime Minister Abe are members of the same political party. But I also think Japanese citizens are, they're grown-ups. They can distinguish between this tragedy that's happened today and also the election, which is about different issues. It's mainly going to be about inflation, cost of living, and these kinds of issues, as we're seeing across the globe, elections being about these kinds of topics.
All right, thank you so much to Tina Burritt, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University in Tokyo. Of course, to reiterate, we now have confirmation that former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has died after a gunshot wound to the neck earlier this morning when he was shot at a campaign event in Nara. Abe, of course, had 2 terms as the Japanese Prime Minister, making him the longest serving, the first term being from 2006 to 2007, then again from 2012 to 2020, which is, of course, when Abenomics was introduced, the idea that they will ease monetary policy, boost fiscal spending, all trying to get Japan out of decades of stagnation and deflation. That Abenomics legacy, of course, is one that will continue to live on. But again, after being shot at a campaign event earlier today, Japanese former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died at the age of 67.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition, and this is what you need to know. The former Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has died after being shot at a campaign event. It is stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are rare. A suspect has been arrested. Abe was 67 and was Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister. Federal Reserve hawks are still pushing for a 75 basis point hike this month to fight inflation. Both Chris Waller and James Bullard are downplaying fears the U.S. economy is heading for a recession. Today's U.S. jobs report will be a likely factor in that central bank decision. And Boris Johnson is pressed to make a quicker exit from number 10 Downing Street. The Conservative Party wants to choose his successor by the end of the summer. The Prime Minister's office has floated a 3-month timetable. It did so yesterday. I'm Guy Johnson in London, Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. Anna Edwards is off today. Matt, set us up for the U.S. markets.
Well, it's important to point out that a lot of times traders will wait until these big numbers come out, like a non-farm payrolls number or a Fed decision, before they make serious moves. Nonetheless, we do see a bit of a sell-off in futures right now, down a little less than 0.5%, and investors are buying the 10-year bond, pushing the yield down just over 1 basis point to 298.16. We have had a decent week in the cash trade to set us up for this, so possibly some profit-taking going on. It is interesting to watch NYMEX crude. We've been bouncing back and forth between gains and losses. There have been concerns about, obviously, the supply. It's difficult to see that much spare capacity coming out. On the other hand, we've had recession concerns. So we've been pushed down below 100. Right now, we're back up above it at 102.11 for a barrel of Texas Intermediate. And Bitcoin is off just a bit, this number from midnight. But it's been a good week for Bitcoin. We're up to 21,502, and that's definitely something to watch. Kailey, what do you see in terms of the U.S. pre-market movers?
Well, there's a lot of them moving lower today. No surprise given the broader risk-off sentiment, but there is some more idiosyncrasies we have to focus on as well, like for GameStop, which fired its CFO and is now cutting employees as well as it tries to adjust to shifting demand in the video game space. It's down about 7% before the bell. And of course, the other news we got overnight yesterday was that report out of the Washington Post that Elon Musk's $44 billion deal to buy Twitter is in jeopardy due to that whole bots issue that he's really worried about. Apparently, Musk and his team are no longer even engaging in discussions around the funding of the deal. So Twitter is down about 4% at $37.15 a share at the moment. Of course, the offer price was $54.20. Meanwhile, Tesla also is down about 1.3%. But that may have more to do with the fact that we're seeing some of those tech stocks that have done really well so far this week giving back some of those gains this morning. And that includes Apple, down about 0.7% before the bell, Guy.
Kailey, European stocks are just drifting into that payroll number. To be honest, there's nothing to see here. Yesterday, a good session The focus is elsewhere. Euro dollar, we are firmly on parity watch. We are approaching that number. The payroll number could push us through parity. Pay attention a little bit later on. But I think the real story in Europe surrounds what is happening in the energy markets. European electricity prices are shooting higher once again today. We are seeing nat gas coming down a touch. Remember, Monday, Nord Stream 1 is turned off for maintenance. That's the huge gas pipeline that comes out of Russia into Germany. Gas prices are up on the week. This is the pivotal story for Europe. We don't know. You cannot predict what the economic outcome in Europe is going to be until you can answer the question, will the gas stay on or will it be turned off? Will there be enough gas going into winter is critical. But electricity prices are doing damage right now. We see German yields coming lower today. And again, that is a reflection of the reality of what is happening on the continent right now, Kailey.
Absolutely. Well, let's focus on another continent for a moment. The news out of Asia, specifically Japan, overnight that the former prime minister, the longest serving prime minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has been killed, assassinated earlier after being shot at a campaign event, dead at the age of 67. Let's get more on his legacy, his economic legacy in particular. Joachim Fels, global economic advisor at PIMCO, joins us now. Joachim, just your reaction to the events of this morning and how Japan is different today than before Abenomics took over.
Yeah, so very sad news, obviously, Kailey. I think Shinzo Abe's legacy is very much alive. When he was prime minister, he was the architect of a policy of combined monetary fiscal stimulus to overcome deflation. And I think his legacy will be that this actually helped to lift Japan out of deflation. So the Bank of Japan strategy of yield curve control, which is still in place and which is, I think, under review at the moment, that really helped to get us out of deflation, and the government helped under Abe by pursuing a expansionary fiscal policy. So I think this is what will remain.
Well, you speak of the Bank of Japan's yield curve control, and obviously the markets have been pressuring them potentially to change that, in that we still have a Japanese yen right around its weakest level since 1998, even before the time of Abe. And I'm wondering whether you see a coming change from the Bank of Japan and if his death may accelerate that change at all.
I think the policy will change eventually. My guess is that Governor Kuroda, BOJ Governor Kuroda, will want to hand over to his successor a slight change in the policy. It's always easier if the outgoing governor initiates those changes. There are two options, I think, that the BOJ will be considering over the next few months. One is to raise the cap on 10-year JGB yields, currently 25 basis points. So this may be raised to 50 or even 75 basis points. The other option is to move the cap from the 10-year sector of the yield curve down to the 5-year sector. In both cases, this would allow a further steepening of the Japanese yield curve, and that is something that will help Japanese financial institutions and could therefore support the recovery. Also, this could stop the weakening of the yen, which I think is now starting to become a concern in Japan because it's putting strong upward pressure on input prices.
If they raise the cap, Joachim, is that going to be jarring for financial markets? Something like when the Swiss National Bank dropped the peg on the franc?
I think it may not be as strong a signal for markets as when the SNB changed the FX intervention, Matt. But yes, I think this could put some upward pressure on global yields, given the importance of the yen carry trade for global fixed income markets. So this is perhaps the last shoe to drop, the last shoe we still need to see to drop before becoming more confident that we have seen the peak for global yields.
Joachim, I find it hard to predict what is going to happen in the second half of the year without having a full understanding of whether or not Europe is going to end up in stagnation. We could find ourselves in a situation where gas is turned off by the Russians. We have Nord Stream 1 going into maintenance Monday. It should be out for 10 days. We don't know. Electricity prices are already shooting to the moon. They are going to do significant damage economically at these levels. How on earth do I come up with a reasonable kind of prediction for global growth if I don't know the answer to that question?
Yeah, I think you're right, Guy. This is incredibly hard at the moment because I think a lot depends on factors that are almost impossible to forecast. So will the gas be turned off? What's the further path for food prices, for energy prices overall? So right now, I think we are in this twilight zone between stagflation. That's how I would characterize the current situation. Inflation too high, activity too low and slowing. So we're in this twilight zone between stagflation and recession. Really hard to say how it ends. My guess is eventually we will end up in what will hopefully be a relatively mild recession. In the US, by the way, we may already be in recession on some of those indicators, like 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Europe is still lagging a little bit behind because we still see the effects of the reopening of the economy in the service sector, so strong demand for services, for travel, and so on. But obviously, high energy prices, high inflation is biting. It is eating into real disposable incomes.
Yeah.
So I think a recession is quite likely over the next 3 to 6 months, both in the US and in Europe.
Well, Joachim, your words are a stark contrast to what we're hearing out of Federal Reserve officials. Christopher Waller, Jim Bullard yesterday, both playing down the risk of a recession, saying they want to move 75 basis points again this month. How could the job numbers we see later on today inform whether that move in a couple weeks is actually one of 75 basis points?
So I don't think the job numbers will have a big impact on the Fed's decision. I think the Fed is now really out to kill inflation. It took them a long time to, get to this stance, but I think it's quite likely they do 75 at the next meeting, irrespective of what the job numbers later today will bring. I think the Fed currently is entirely focused on inflation. The dual mandate has become a single mandate for now. I think they're even willing to risk a recession, at least a mild recession, to bring inflation down, because at 8.6% and possibly soon 9% headline CPI inflation, that's really the thing that matters. And I think they all remember an old saying amongst central bankers, which is that only hawks get to go to central banker heaven.
Yeah, that must sound like a fun place. Joachim, thank you very much indeed. Joachim Fels of PIMCO, thank you very much. Coming up, Tobias Harris, Senior Fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress. We'll, of course, be talking about the implications of the assassination of Shinzo Abe. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the principal room. Coming up later today, David Balin, Chief Investment Officer of Citi Global Wealth Management. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kailey Leinz with Matt Miller in New York and Guy Johnson in London. Anna Edwards is off today. And Guy, Matt, we thought we would be focusing today on the jobs report coming out of the U.S. at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, but instead we all have been rocked by the news out of Japan that former Prime Minister, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has died at the age of 67 after being shot at a campaign event. It is stunning news in a country where political violence and guns are rare. Tobias Harris, Senior Fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress, joins us now. Tobias, just please, your reaction to the events of this morning and how it could shape Japan going forward.
It's absolutely stunning. I mean, from the moment that the news broke that in a routine campaign appearance that former Prime Minister Abe was shot and in critical condition, it's just been absolutely stunning. And he was, I think, at the moment of his death, I mean, he was the most powerful politician in Japan, even as a former prime minister. I mean, he wielded tremendous influence, and certainly politically, his death leaves, I think, a considerable power vacuum, and it's not exactly clear how that will be filled.
In terms of the more immediate effects, we have elections coming up Sunday. Do you think there will be a ripple from what has happened here into voting?
Well, I mean, I think, the LDP Komeito ruling coalition was already heading towards what looked like an easy victory in all polls. And so I think the only question is going to be is if you were to get some sort of sympathy vote that increased turnout and maybe made the LDP's victory bigger. I mean, I think it looked like it was going to be a stretch for the LDP to win a majority of its own. Maybe this changes the equation on that front. That, I think certainly there might be some sort of sympathy vote. I think, I think across the political spectrum, I think people are shocked by something like this. You have not seen anything remotely like this in maybe more than 60 years. But really, I mean, given how stable and placid Japanese politics has been, this kind of event is just, I mean, it's almost unthinkable.
Are there policy implications? There was discussion within the market a little bit earlier on talking about the idea that if the LDP did better, that would allow maybe the government to take the pressure off the BOJ when it comes to fighting inflation, dealing with inflation. That could be one impact that could feed through into financial markets. Are there obvious lines that you can progress in terms of arguments around how this could shape policy?
It's really hard to say because it could cut a number of different ways. I mean, Abe was a major voice, of course, in favor of much more defense spending, of a much more assertive defense posture, and also basically also in favor of considerably more deficit spending to pay for more defense spending. And so his voice, absent from those debates, maybe changes things. But on the other hand, it's possible that the LDP is going to unify around what Abe believed and really push to get done what he wanted in these upcoming debates. And so, I mean, it's really too early to say exactly how that's going to shake out. And certainly, it changes, I think, the immediate political landscape for Prime Minister Kishida, who I think ever since he became Prime Minister, he's had to be engaged in this delicate dance with Abe, whose support was critical for him winning. But on the other hand, Abe had very strong opinions about what Kishida should do. And now, absent that pressure from Abe, it's not exactly clear what preferences of Kishida's own will win out in these debates.
Is it time? Abe was at the forefront, really, of this move away from a pacifist stance towards a more assertive stance in terms of Japan's sovereignty and in terms of the threat that China has proved. Is it time now, especially after what we've seen in Germany, for post-war Japan to start building up a strong military power of its own?
Well, what's remarkable is that we've seen probably more change in terms of building a public consensus around Japan spending more on defense and maybe even just being more assertive in its posture since the Ukraine war began than we have, I think, after decades of agitation by conservatives like Abe and his allies, and which goes to show, I think, that there's something particularly resonant about the images that have come out of Ukraine, watching people huddle in the Kyiv subway in the early days of the war and the impact, people living under rocket fire. And I think that's made a very strong impression on the Japanese public. And it also suggests that the Japanese public might be more comfortable with that kind of policy change under someone like Kishida, who has sold himself as a liberal dove, as opposed to someone like Abe, who was, a very assertive hawk. And I think made people uncomfortable with his zeal for that kind of change. And so in some ways, the obstacles, the barriers that I think you saw to that kind of policy shift in the past are certainly lower now than they had been.
Sum up for us the legacy that Shinzo Abe leaves behind. I mean, he comes from such an historically important family, even in terms of serving in government. I think his brother is still the vice minister for foreign affairs. And his wife has been a vocal opponent of a lot of his policies. This is really kind of a political dynasty, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, he knew that he was carrying a dynasty forward into the future, and really committed to the idea that Japan needs to be a leading power in the world, in the first rank of nations. And in some ways, he did not fully achieve what he wanted. I think Japan still has, a pretty grim demographic outlook. It's hard to say that it's fully left behind the stagnation of the past. Clearly it has challenges, but I think in terms of creating a Japan that was confident enough to act as a leader globally and regionally. I certainly think he developed a blueprint that he pursued in power, and then his successors have followed as well. And for Japan being an assertive leader when it comes to trade talks, when it comes to strengthening relations with its neighbors, when it comes to having a strong alliance with the United States, all of those things he was committed to and delivered on in office. And I think it's very hard to imagine his successors deviating from that. I mean, he really has laid down a set of policies that I think, as I think Abe was fond of saying, that there is no alternative to what he offered.
Tobias Harris, thank you for the analysis. We greatly appreciate it. Tobias Harris, Senior Fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress. Thank you very much indeed. We'll continue the conversation and discuss further this man's legacy. Shocking news today, the assassination of Shinzo Abe, 1954 to 2022.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in New York with Guy Johnson in London. We want to go live now to Nara, Japan, where former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot and killed. Bloomberg's Kurumi Mori is there. She just attended the presser by the Nara Medical University, or at the Nara Medical University Hospital. Kurumi, tell us what we know about what transpired earlier today in Japan.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just inside the room where the hospital president and the ER doctor in charge of treating Abe just spoke to the press. Dr. Fukushima did most of the talking during this press. And he told us that he was able to stop the major bleeding when former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe arrived at the hospital. But by then, too much blood was lost. A bullet had pierced Abe's neck and heart in 2 places. He had died about 3 hours of being in surgery, unfortunately declared dead at 5:03 p.m. local time here. Of course, very upsetting news. I'm walking around the campus now. I had left the presser. There's another building where the emergency services staff is, and I just took a peek inside. There's Secret Service just lining the halls, presumably towards Shinzo Abe's room. We saw Akiya Abe, his wife, of course, had arrived at the hospital just a short while ago. So again, of course, the assassination sending a huge shock throughout Japan.
Kurumi, can you talk to us about how much protection he had? How did this happen?
Yeah, that's the question we are all asking right now. We're seeing a lot of security officials, of course, now at the hospital, walking around, checking everybody. But during the actual incident, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was near the train station, and he was campaigning for the upcoming upper house elections. Now, this is pretty common. Notable politicians like Abe go on the road to rally support for candidates leading up to elections. But there is hardly much security there. I mean, of course, he had his security officials, but you could get quite close to these politicians on the ground. So we are still learning more and more about how this exactly happened.
Kurumi, thank you very much indeed for the updates. Kurumi Mori joining us from Japan. Matt, that's the story we've been focusing on. We're going to focus later on what is happening, of course, with the jobs picture. Euro dollar, I have to say, trading 101.20. Maybe we go through parity later on.
Yeah, and it's been below 101 today. We are obviously going to be focused on the jobs number as we are every month. But I think it's interesting that Joachim Fels said he doesn't think the jobs number is going to have a big impact on the Fed's decision because they're already slotted in for a 75 basis point hike. That's it for Surveillance Early Edition.